The gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelle, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you, Chief, for being here. I do want to, I'm disturbed by both the sense that you don't blame the rioters or the president, but you blame the Capitol Police and the Capitol Police Board, and not you, sir, my colleagues. It's like blaming a homeowner when he or she is robbed instead of blaming the intruder. And so I do want to note one thing, too, because it sounds awfully partisan and awfully political. Just not that I'm blaming anyone, but I just note Mr. Irving is a sergeant-at-arms appointed by John Boehner and reappointed by Speaker Ryan. Mr. Stenger, who's passed away and couldn't testify if we wanted to him, sadly, but was appointed by Senator McConnell. And the third member of the board, which you're not a member of when you were a Capitol Police Chief, by the way. The board is 3 other people, I acknowledge that. Third one is the architect of the Capitol, which was at the time Mr. Blanton, appointed by President Trump. So to inject partisanship here, I think is very troubling, but if we're gonna do that, we should at least note the obvious, that each of the members of the 3-person board were appointed by Republicans, not by Democrats. But I do wanna go back to a couple of things that I think are really important. One is I do want to talk a little bit about the delay, which I consider unconscionable between your call with the Pentagon leadership and the ultimate deployment of the National Guard, which, as I understood, took over 3 hours to be able to do. That was a request of the Secretary of Defense. I want to know, Chief, do you know now, or did you know at the time, about a memo on January 4th from the Secretary of Defense to the Secretary of the Army and a January 5th letter from the Secretary of the Army to the Commanding General of the D.C. National Guard? Are you familiar with those memos?
I've become familiar with them after January 6th, yes, sir.
Yeah, and as I read the material, that, among others, they were told that the Guard could not be issued weapons, helmets, body armor. They could not interact physically with protesters. They could not employ any riot control agents, and they could not make arrests and could not use a quick reaction force. Is that your understanding now of the correspondence that went on between the Secretary of the Army and the Secretary of Defense?
Yes, that is correct. The Secretary of Defense wrote the first memo January 4th, and the Secretary of the Army put the additional restrictions on what's called the QRF, the Quick Reactionary Force, to William Walker after the fact.
So, by the way, you said you did not know that leading up to January 6th that those restrictions were in place, sir?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
And I assume at the time you would have been led to believe that the National Guard was essentially a phone call away to be able, if necessary. No, were you not under that belief?
I was definitely under that belief. After I had requested the National Guard Sunday morning, the 2 Sergeant-at-Arms had me reach out to William Walker. Instead of authorizing them, just say, hey, if we need assistance, could you kind of be ready, be on standby? I talked to him 6:14 p.m. that evening, on Sunday evening, the 3rd, and took that information back. He said, yeah, he'd be leaning forward, but he needs authorization from the, he didn't say anything about the memo, because it hadn't come out yet, I guess.
Nor, just so I understand, nor did he say anything about the restrictions that the memo had placed on the deployment of the National Guard should they be requested.
That is correct. And also, just to add additional to that, January 5th, I held a meeting with many of the top law enforcement officials from around the city, including the FBI and the Commanding General for the D.C. National Guard, and nothing was said to me again on that conference call. And that was also with the Capitol Police Board.
You know, and you and I unfortunately didn't have a chance to work professionally together, but I do reach out to Chief Manger from time to time when there are concerns or there are, seemingly threats, and we have conversations. I assume you did that to predecessors on both sides of the aisle, that there would be conversations leading up to events like January 6th when you knew people would be at least on alert. Is that true?
So a lot of the times, those conversations would go directly to the 2 Sergeant-at-Arms.
Yeah.
Because I know the Sergeant-at-Arms that oftentimes would have recommendations to me or advice to me to limit my direct communications with members, because once I open that door, they can't protect me. So they would
So if this subject came up, you would not, so what I'm getting at, I guess, is, neither the Sergeant of Arms nor the architect of the Capitol nor you were aware that the National Guard had restrictions placed on it, so even while you're waiting for the call for hours, you still didn't know that those restrictions were in place. And that seems to me is a big part of this storyline.
That is correct. Knowing those restrictions in place, because I'm a stakeholder. When the police department becomes overwhelmed and we dial 911 because we need assistance, that goes to the National Guard.
Yeah.
It sure as hell would have been great to know that they put out this memo restricting the National Guard from assisting my men and women in advance of January 6th, knowing now that they were so damn concerned about the violence that they were expecting to come on January 6th, and no one ever told me about it?
Yeah, and
That's
that way, I
terrible.
mean, and I hate to state the obvious, but that's the Pentagon's Department of Defense, the Department of Department of the Army. No one at that time told you that the National Guard, even if they were called up, would have severe restrictions. I just want to make sure I did that. And before I yield back, if I might, unless you'd like to call me at another time, just to enter items into the record without objection, if I can do that now, Mr. Chairman, or would you?
Well,
wait?
I would entertain that now, but I think you've got a good line of questioning here. If it's okay with the minority, and we have so few people here, I'd be open to doing another round of questions.
Okay,
if
that's fine. Yes,
So we'll do that then.
Okay, I'll yield back. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Morelle.